A courier who would not give his name handed me a padded envelope in the hospital parking garage before 7 in the morning, told me someone had paid him in cash to make sure I opened it alone, and walked away before I could ask a single question. Inside was one photograph. Black and white, curled soft at the corners the way old photographs get when they've spent decades folded inside someone's wallet instead of framed on a wall. A young woman in a nurse's uniform stood in front of a hospital entrance I didn't recognize, laughing at something outside the frame, one hand pressed flat against her own chest, like she was steadying herself. I had never seen her face before in my life, and yet something about the way she stood, the particular tilt of her chin, made the back of my neck go cold before I understood why. On the back, in handwriting that wasn't mine, and wasn't anyone I currently knew, someone had written 7 words. She saved you before you saved anyone. I stood in that parking garage for 11 minutes without moving, holding a stranger's face in my hand, before I finally understood that this photograph was not a mistake, and it was not meant for anyone else. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. My name is Dr. Renee Winters. I'm 43 years old, a pediatrician, and by now most people who know me at all know that strange, unmarked things have found their way to me before. 12 years of unsigned lilies taught me that much about the world, and about myself. But this was different. This wasn't a bouquet left on a windshield by a man mourning his wife. This was a photograph of a woman I had never met, delivered in secret, with a sentence on the back that suggested she had done something for me before I was even born into the version of my life I understood. My husband, Nathaniel, took one look at the photograph over breakfast and asked the question I hadn't let myself ask yet. Who sends a woman a stranger's face and calls it a debt owed? My mother-in-law, Geraldine, of all people, went quiet in a way I'd rarely seen from her, turning the photograph over twice before setting it down like it had weight. 3 questions sat unanswered in my kitchen that morning. Who was this woman? What had she supposedly done for me, decades before I could have possibly known her? And why, after however many years of silence, had someone decided now was finally the time I needed to know? To understand why one photograph could unsettle me so completely, you have to understand what my second year of residency actually looked like, because I have spent most of my adult life not talking about it. 17 years ago, I was 26 years old, 3 months into my second year of pediatric residency at a teaching hospital in Cincinnati, Ohio, 4 hours from the Louisville practice I run today and the family I hadn't built yet. I was exhausted in a way I don't think I've ever fully recovered from. 30-hour call shifts, an attending physician named Dr. Gerald Steele who corrected my work in front of patients' families to make a point of his own authority, and a version of myself so tired I sometimes couldn't remember driving home. I don't say any of this looking for sympathy. I say it because it matters for what happened next, and because a first-time viewer deserves the full shape of it, not just the parts that make me look brave. There was a nurse on that floor everyone called Nurse B. I never learned why the shortened name stuck, only that she'd worked nights on that unit longer than anyone could remember, that she moved through codes and crying parents with the same unhurried calm, and that she seemed to notice things the rest of us were too tired to catch. I remember her voice more clearly than her face after all these years, which tells you something about how thin my memory of that season really is. I remember that she caught things, a dosage that looked right on paper and wasn't, a monitor reading that Dr. Steele dismissed as artifact that she quietly asked me to double-check anyway. I remember thinking, even at the time, that she was better at this than most of the doctors on that floor, myself included. My husband Nathaniel and I weren't married yet during my residency. We'd met the year before at a mutual friend's wedding, and he was still finishing his own graduate program 3 states away, which meant most of what I lived through that year I lived through largely alone, narrating it to him over phone calls he could only half enter into from a distance. My mother-in-law Geraldine likes to remind me, now, that she thought I looked like a woman who was disappearing into her own job that year, though at the time she and I barely knew each other. My father-in-law Harold has never said much about that period at all, which is its own kind of eloquence with him. What I didn't know what I have never known, until the morning that envelope landed in my hands, was that during one particular overnight shift in my 3rd month, a newborn on that unit had crashed in a way that should have ended in a very different outcome than it did. I remembered the baby. I did not, until that morning, remember the full truth of what had actually saved her. The story I had always carried, the story written into my own memory, the way we write stories to survive our own exhaustion, was that I had caught the deterioration myself, adjusted the treatment plan myself, and been quietly praised for it by Dr. Steele in the weeks that followed. One of the few moments of validation I got that entire year, and one I had held on to, in the years since, as proof that even at my most depleted, I had still been good at the thing I'd trained my whole life to do. It was the story I told myself on the hardest nights of my career. It was, apparently, not entirely true. I am telling you this now, plainly, because the woman in that photograph, the young nurse in the black and white photo, standing in front of a hospital entrance I hadn't recognized because it had been demolished and rebuilt over a decade ago, was Nurse B. Her real name, I would learn within days, was Blanche Whitley. And the sentence on the back of that photograph, "She saved you before you saved anyone," was not, as I first assumed, about the baby at all. It was about me. And I had no idea, standing in that parking garage with my hands shaking, exactly what that meant, or why it had taken 17 years and a courier who wouldn't give his name for someone to finally tell me. I did the only thing that made sense to a woman who has spent her whole career trusting documentation over memory. I went looking for the record. Cincinnati General had merged with a larger health system 11 years ago, and most of its physical archive had been boxed, scanned, or simply lost in the transition, which meant a phone call to medical records got me nothing but a polite apology and a case number I could submit for a formal request that would take, they told me, up to 90 days. I didn't have 90 days. I wasn't sure, if I'm honest, that I had 90 hours before I stopped being able to think about anything else. Nathaniel found me at 11 that night, still sitting at the kitchen table, with the photograph propped against the sugar bowl, a legal pad in front of me, covered in nothing but the same 3 words written over and over. Blanche Whitley, who? "You've been treating this like a chart you have to read before you can sleep," he said, which was exactly what I'd been doing, and exactly what I couldn't stop doing. He didn't tell me to let it go. He'd learned better than that. 17 years into knowing me, even if we hadn't been married yet when it happened. He just asked what I actually needed, which was, it turned out, someone who understood how to find a hospital's forgotten paper trail better than I did. My mother-in-law Geraldine surprised me 2 days later by showing up at my clinic unannounced with a name and a phone number written on the back of a grocery receipt. "There's a woman who runs the local history room at the Cincinnati Public Library," she said. "She helped a friend of mine track down her grandfather's hospital records from the 40s. I called her this morning. Her name is Delphine Hartley." I hadn't asked Geraldine to do any of this. I'm still not entirely sure why she did, except that she told me, almost offhandedly, that she'd once been the kind of woman who wondered who'd really been in the room when things went right for her too, and had never gotten the chance to ask. Delphine Hartley turned out to be exactly the kind of person this required. Patient, precise, and entirely unbothered by the fact that I was calling her in a state closer to panic than curiosity. She specialized in tracing photographs to their studios and dates through print stock, studio stamps, and hospital annual reports that had survived in the library's donated collections long after the hospitals themselves stopped keeping them. It took her 4 days to confirm what I'd already begun to suspect from the photograph's paper stock alone. It had been developed at a studio 2 blocks from the old Cincinnati General campus. In a batch, the studio's surviving ledger dated to the same month, 17 years ago, that I had been a second-year resident on that unit. "There's something else," Delphine told me on our 4th call, and I could hear her hesitating in a way she hadn't through 3 days of dry archival detail. "The library got a donation last year, a woman's personal papers, after she passed. Newspaper clippings, hospital newsletters, that kind of thing. There's a name in there I think you should see before I say anything else." She sent the scanned page that afternoon. A photocopied internal hospital newsletter from 17 years ago. A single paragraph buried on page 4, recognizing a nurse for what it called exceptional clinical judgment during a critical overnight event on the pediatric unit. The nurse's name in that paragraph was Blanche Whitley. The physician credited in the same paragraph, praised by name for leading the response, was not me. It was Dr. Gerald Steele. I read that paragraph 4 times before the shape of it fully landed. I hadn't imagined the praise I remembered receiving that year. Dr. Steele had in fact told me privately that I'd handled the situation well. The one compliment I'd carried for 17 years like a small stone in my pocket. What I hadn't known, what apparently no one outside that unit had ever known publicly, was that the version of events written into the hospital's own official record credited him alone for a catch he hadn't actually made, and buried entirely, in a single unread newsletter paragraph, was the name of the woman who actually had. I called Delphine back within the hour, my hands not quite steady on the phone. "I need to know who sent me that photograph," I said. "I need to know if Blanche Whitley is even still alive." There was a long pause on her end of the line, the particular kind of pause that meant she already knew the answer, and wasn't sure yet how much of it was hers to tell me. "She died 11 years ago," Delphine finally said. "But her mother didn't. She's 91, Dr. Winters. And as far as I can tell from the donor records, she's the one who gave the library her daughter's papers. I think she might be the one who sent you that photograph too." For a day and a half after that call, I did something I'm not particularly proud of. I let myself imagine every version of this story except the simplest one. I wondered whether Dr. Steele himself had somehow arranged the delivery, decades of guilt finally catching up to him in a strange, indirect confession. I wondered whether Blanche Whitley had left some kind of grievance behind, a formal complaint I'd never known existed, and whether this photograph was the opening move of something closer to a lawsuit than a memorial. Nathaniel, patient as ever, let me talk through each theory out loud at the kitchen table without once telling me I was overthinking it, though I suspect he thought exactly that. It was Nora, of all people, who finally said the thing that reset my thinking. "Mom," she said, not looking up from her homework, "maybe somebody just wants you to know something true before it's too late to tell you." 15 years old, and she'd cut through 4 days of my speculation in one sentence. Delphine called back the following afternoon with an address, and with a warning I hadn't expected. "The donor listed on the library's records is Estella Whitley," she said. "But there's a note in the file from the intake volunteer. Apparently a man came in with her the day she dropped off the boxes, and he wasn't happy about it. Wanted to know why she was giving away his sister's things to strangers. I don't know what that means for you walking in there, but I didn't want you going in blind. Before I tell you what happened when I finally found her, I want to ask something of you watching this. If a story like this has you leaning forward already, take a second to hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what you would have done in my position, because what came next, I promise you, is not what I expected to find at the end of that phone call." Delphine found an address within 2 days. Not a nursing home, but a small brick house in a neighborhood not far from where the old hospital used to stand, still listed under the name Estella Whitley. I drove the 4 hours from Louisville alone on a Thursday, telling Nathaniel I'd call when I knew more, telling my daughter Nora, who is 15 and had taken an unusual interest in the whole mystery, that I'd tell her everything when I understood it myself. My 8-year-old son Elijah had asked, with the particular bluntness of an 8-year-old, whether the lady in the photograph was a ghost. I told him no. I wasn't entirely sure, driving there, that I believed myself. A man answered the door before I'd finished knocking. He introduced himself as Marlon Whitley, told me he was Estella's son and Blanche's younger brother, and made it clear within 30 seconds that he had not been expecting me, had not approved of whatever his mother had done, and would prefer I leave before she got any more worked up than she apparently already was. "She's 91 years old," he said, standing squarely in the doorway rather than stepping aside. "She's had 2 small strokes this year. Whatever she's decided to stir up now, it isn't worth what it'll cost her to relive it. For a moment, standing on that porch, I genuinely considered that Marlon himself might be the one who'd sent the photograph. Some kind of test, or a warning dressed up as a gift, though I couldn't yet imagine what he'd want from me. It wasn't until Estella's voice came from somewhere behind him, thin but entirely certain, calling my name like she'd been waiting years to say it out loud, that I understood the photograph had never been his idea at all. Estella Whitley was smaller than I expected, seated in a wingback chair by a window with a quilt over her knees, and she looked at me the way people look at something they've rehearsed seeing for a long time. "You have her chin," she said, before I'd even sat down, and I didn't need to ask whose. Marlon hovered in the doorway behind me the entire visit, arms crossed, clearly unhappy, though he didn't try again to make me leave. Estella told me, slowly and in pieces, what her daughter had never told anyone outside that unit until very near the end of her own life. That the night I remembered as my own quiet victory had actually unfolded the way Blanche always privately described it to her mother, in the handful of times she ever spoke of it at all. Blanche had caught the deterioration first, a subtle change in color and breathing rhythm that Dr. Steele, exhausted himself and irritated at being paged, had initially waved off as a monitor glitch. She had pushed back twice, quietly and through the proper channels, and when he still refused to act, she had done something nurses at that hospital were explicitly forbidden from doing without physician sign-off. She'd adjusted the oxygen delivery herself, by a small, precise margin, buying the exact amount of time it took for me to arrive on that unit, review the chart she'd already flagged, and make the call that ultimately saved that baby. I had believed, for 17 years, that I'd caught it myself. In the truest sense, I had only caught what she'd already caught first, and bought me the room to catch. The hospital found out 3 weeks later, during an unrelated chart audit that surfaced her unauthorized adjustment. Dr. Steele, protecting his own account of that night and his own standing, told the review board that Nurse Whitley's action had been reckless and unnecessary, that his own clinical judgment had already been correcting the problem when she intervened. Blanche was formally reprimanded, quietly stripped of her charge nurse eligibility, and effectively pushed out of that hospital within the year. Not fired outright, Estella told me, but made so professionally unwelcome that she resigned rather than fight it. She left nursing within 2 years entirely, and never spoke of medicine again in any detail her own family could piece together, until the last 6 months of her life, when the strokes had started and she'd begun, slowly, telling her mother everything she'd carried alone for a decade and a half. She kept one photograph from that whole hospital, Estella said, the only one she ever kept. She told me, near the end, that she wanted the doctor in it to know the truth before she died herself. Not for an apology, she said. She didn't much care about that anymore. She wanted someone to know it happened. That was all. I promised her I'd find you, whenever I was ready, and it took me longer than I'd like to admit, because I was afraid of exactly what happened on my porch just now. My own son, worried I was about to reopen something that already cost our family enough. Marlon finally spoke again from the doorway, quieter than before. Dr. Steele is still on the regional hospital board, he said. He's got his name on a research wing 2 counties over. I wasn't trying to protect a secret. I was trying to protect my mother from getting dragged through something at 91 that already broke my sister once. It was, I realized, listening to him, not malice I'd been standing across from on that porch. It was the particular exhaustion of a man who had already watched one member of his family lose something to that hospital and didn't trust that the truth, once loose, wouldn't come looking for a second one. Estella offered me tea before we got any further into it, and Marlon, still standing rigidly by the window, poured it himself without being asked. The kind of small, automatic kindness that told me more about him than anything he'd said at the door. I noticed, on the mantel behind Estella's chair, a row of framed photographs spanning what looked like 6 decades of the family's life, and exactly one nursing school graduation portrait among them, tucked slightly behind the others, as if it had been placed there and then quietly pushed back over the years. I asked Estella, gently, why she'd chosen a photograph and 7 handwritten words instead of simply calling my clinic or writing me a letter that explained everything plainly. She considered the question for a long moment, the quilt shifting slightly on her knees. "Because a letter, you can set aside," she said. "A photograph of a face you don't recognize, you have to sit with. I wanted you sitting with her before I explained a single thing. The way I've been sitting with her memory every day for 11 years since she passed." It was, I realized, exactly what had happened. I'd carried that photograph in my bag for the better part of 2 weeks before I understood who it was, and something about not knowing had kept it closer to me than a name ever would have. Marlon finally sat down across from me before I left. The first time all afternoon he hadn't been standing guard in some capacity. He told me, more freely once he'd decided I wasn't a threat, that he'd spent years quietly resenting a hospital system he couldn't ever quite explain to people outside the family. "How do you explain that your sister was punished for being right?" he asked me. "Without sounding like you're inventing a grievance nobody will believe." He'd stopped telling the story to new people entirely, he said, somewhere around the 5th time someone changed the subject on him. Hearing that a doctor, one who'd actually been in the room, might finally be willing to say she'd been right all along was, he admitted, more than he'd let himself hope for in a long time, even if he'd spent the whole afternoon acting like he didn't want it. I sat with all of that for longer than I want to admit. I had a photograph, a dying nurse's final wish delivered secondhand through her mother, an old paragraph in a newsletter no one had read in 17 years, and a family that was, understandably, unsure whether letting me carry this truth forward would heal anything or simply reopen it. What I didn't yet have was any idea what Dr. Gerald Steele, still practicing, still respected, still, apparently, sitting on a hospital board with his name attached to a wing of a building, would do if he learned that the true version of that night was finally about to surface, 17 years after he'd made sure it never did. If you've made it this far into Blanche Whitley's story, I'd love for you to turn on notifications for this channel, because what happens when I finally reach out to Dr. Steele myself is not the confrontation any of us expected. I found Dr. Gerald Steele through nothing more complicated than the regional hospital system's own website. A photo of him in a gray suit beside a plaque bearing his name. Chair of a research committee, 2 counties from where I'd once been his exhausted, 26-year-old resident. I didn't call ahead. I drove to a Tuesday morning committee meeting listed as open to hospital staff, waited in the hallway until it let out, and said his name before I'd fully decided what I was going to say next. He recognized me before I said anything else, which surprised me. "Winters," he said, the way you'd greet someone you remembered fondly and vaguely, a name attached to a decent resident from a long time ago rather than anything more specific. I told him I needed 10 minutes. He gave me 5, standing in a hallway rather than sitting in his office, which told me something about how much weight he expected this conversation to carry. I told him about the photograph. I told him about Blanche Whitley, about Estella, about the newsletter paragraph Delphine had found, about the review board record that credited him alone for a catch that had never fully been his. I watched his face while I said it, the way you watch a monitor for the smallest change in rhythm, and for a long moment he didn't give me anything at all. The practiced stillness of a man who had spent a long career not reacting visibly to accusations. "That was a difficult period," he finally said, which wasn't a denial, and wasn't an admission either. Nurse Whitley overstepped. It happens. Sometimes it works out, and it still isn't the standard we can endorse, or the whole system falls apart. I asked him, as evenly as I could manage, whether he remembered telling me privately, the next morning, that I'd handled the situation well. He was quiet for several seconds before he answered. "I remember," he said. "I meant it. You had handled it well. I didn't say it wasn't also true that someone else had handled it first." It was, I realized, the closest thing to an admission I was likely to get. Not an apology, not a correction, just a decades-late acknowledgement that he had known, the entire time, exactly whose judgment had actually bought that baby the minutes she needed. "I'm not here to take anything from you," I told him, and I meant it. though I could feel my own voice shaking slightly as I said it. "I'm here because a woman is dying, and her last wish was that someone finally know what actually happened that night. I'd like the hospital's record corrected. Not punished, corrected." He didn't answer right away. He looked, for the first time in that entire hallway conversation, less like the composed committee chair in the photo on the website, and more like a tired man who had spent 17 years hoping this particular door would simply stay shut on its own. "I'll need to think about what that looks like," he said finally, given how long ago this was, and given that the people who made that decision back then aren't all still on staff to ask. It wasn't a yes. It wasn't a no. It was the sound of a man beginning, reluctantly, to move, which is sometimes, I've learned, the most honest reaction a difficult truth can produce in someone who has spent a very long time avoiding it. I drove back to Estella Whitley's house that same evening rather than heading home, because I owed her more than a phone call after everything she'd risked to find me. Marlon opened the door again, and this time he didn't block it. "She's been asking every hour if you'd called," he said, quieter than before. Something loosened in his posture that hadn't been there on my first visit. I told Estella everything. The hallway, Steele's careful non-denial, his unfinished promise to think about what a correction might even look like now, this many years later. She listened with her hands folded in her lap, and when I finished, she didn't ask me whether I thought he'd actually follow through. "I didn't do this so a hospital would change a piece of paper," she said instead. "I did it so somebody besides me and my son would finally know my daughter's name belonged in that story. You knowing it is the part that mattered. Whatever he does with it now is his own conscience to carry, not mine to chase anymore." Marlon, standing in the doorway behind her for the second time that week, said nothing at all. But he didn't leave the room either, which felt, from where I sat, like its own kind of answer. I asked Estella whether she'd ever considered going to a lawyer instead of a photo album, whether some part of her had wanted to force Dr. Steele into a correction rather than simply hope he'd choose one. She shook her head slowly. "Blanche didn't want a courtroom," she said. "She told me that clearly, near the end. She said if it ever came out, she wanted it to come out because somebody in that building actually believed her, not because a judge made them say so. I promised her I'd try it her way first." I understood, sitting there, that Estella's patience wasn't resignation. It was loyalty to a version of justice her daughter had specifically asked for. One I wasn't sure I'd have had the discipline to honor myself, if our positions had been reversed. Driving home that night, I found myself replaying Dr. Steele's 5 careful sentences in that hallway, turning them over the way you turn over an X-ray looking for something you might have missed on the first pass. He hadn't denied it. He also hadn't offered anything close to what I would have called an apology. I didn't know, at that point, which version of him would show up next. The man who quietly buried an inconvenient truth for 17 years, or the man who might, given enough time to sit with it, finally do something about it. Before I tell you what I decided to do next, because Estella's peace with an uncertain outcome wasn't quite enough to settle mine, if this story has moved you at all, share it with someone who'd understand exactly what it means to finally have your work seen by the one person who mattered. And subscribe so you're here for whatever chapter of my life comes next. 3 weeks passed without a word from Dr. Steele. Long enough that I'd started to assume his careful non-answer in that hallway had simply been his way of ending an uncomfortable conversation without ever intending to act on it. I'd made my peace, mostly, with the idea that Estella's version of closure, that the knowing itself was the point, might have to be enough for me too. Then a letter arrived, not a phone call, on official regional hospital system letterhead, addressed to me and, separately, to Estella Whitley. The hospital's Clinical Excellence Committee, the letter explained in careful institutional language, had voted to establish an annual nursing recognition award for what it called independent clinical judgment under pressure, and had chosen, at the recommendation of a committee member, to name it after a nurse who had once worked in that system and whose file the committee had recently reviewed. Blanche Whitley's name was in the letter. There was no mention of Dr. Steele's role in the original decision to erase it, no public correction of the hospital's 17-year-old record, Nothing that would ever appear in a newspaper or a headline, just a small plaque, a modest annual award, and a name finally spoken inside the same walls where it had once been quietly taken away. I drove Estella to the unveiling myself. In a wheelchair, Marlon insisted on pushing the entire way, though he stood back once we reached the small gathering in the hospital atrium, a handful of current nurses, a hospital administrator, and, unexpectedly, Dr. Steele himself, standing near the back rather than at the podium, saying nothing during the brief ceremony beyond a quiet nod in Estella's direction when their eyes met across the room. He never apologized to her. Not that day and not in any of the weeks after. I don't know to this day whether he ever fully reckoned with what he'd taken from a nurse who'd simply done her job better than he had on one exhausted night 17 years ago. What I do know is that he showed up, and that showing up, for a man like that, might have been the closest thing to an admission he was capable of giving. Estella held my hand through the entire ceremony, her grip surprisingly strong for a woman who'd had 2 strokes that year. And when the small brass plaque was finally uncovered, Blanche Whitley, it read, simply, along with the dates of her service and the words she chose herself before she died. Estella didn't cry the way I expected her to. She smiled instead, the particular smile of someone who has been carrying a weight for a long time and has finally set it down somewhere it will stay. She passed away 5 weeks later, at home, with Marlon beside her. He called me himself to tell me, and told me something else too, that in her final days, she'd kept the framed photograph of Blanche on her nightstand where she could see it, and had told him, more than once, that finding me had been the last thing on a very long list of things she'd needed to do before she was ready to go. I don't know what to do with a sentence like that, even now. I'm not sure there's a way to fully earn it. Nathaniel asked me, the night after Estella's funeral, whether I thought Dr. Steele had genuinely learned anything from all of this, or whether he'd simply done the smallest possible thing required to make an inconvenient truth go away quietly. I didn't have a clean answer for him. My mother-in-law Geraldine, when I told her the same thing over the phone a few days later, said only that some corrections come dressed up small on purpose, so the people who caused the original harm never have to look at the full size of what they took. My father-in-law Harold, when I mentioned it to him, said even less, but he asked me, quietly, whether I'd ever once wondered how many other Blanche Whitleys were sitting in files no one had ever bothered to open. I didn't have an answer for that either, and I still don't. I keep a small copy of that photograph in my own desk now, not the original. That one stayed with Marlon, which felt right, but a copy Delphine made for me before I left Cincinnati for the last time. Some nights, closing out a chart at the end of a long shift, I think about the version of that story I carried for 17 years without ever once questioning it, and I wonder how much of what any of us believe we've earned in this work was actually handed to us first, quietly, by someone whose name never made it onto the paper. Marlon and I have stayed in touch, in the loose way people do after something like this. A text on the anniversary of his mother's passing, a photograph he sent me last spring of the plaque, now slightly weathered, still bolted to the atrium wall. He told me once that he'd started telling his sister's story again, to new people, without flinching the way he used to when he expected to be doubted. That, more than the plaque itself, felt to me like the actual repair, not the correction the hospital made on paper, but the one that let a grieving brother finally believe his sister's version of her own life out loud, without bracing for someone to argue him out of it. Nora asked me, months later, whether I thought I would have done the same thing Blanche did, if I'd been the one to catch it first, and someone above me had tried to take the credit and bury the risk. I told her honestly that I didn't know, that it's easy to imagine yourself as the person willing to risk a career for a stranger's child, and much harder to know for certain until the moment actually asks it of you. She sat with that answer longer than I expected a 15-year-old to sit with anything, and told me she hoped she'd be brave enough, if it ever came to it. I hope that for her too. I'm still, some nights, not entirely sure I've earned the right to hope it for myself. I've thought a lot, in the months since, about what I actually believe Dr. Steele owed Estella, and Blanche, and honestly, owed me too. Once he understood, I knew the truth. A quiet plaque in a hospital atrium is not nothing. I watched what it did for a 91-year-old woman in her final weeks, and I won't pretend that didn't matter. But I also can't shake the feeling that a man who let another person's career absorb the cost of his own exhaustion for 17 years got to decide the size of his own correction on his own timeline, with no one able to make him do more than he was already comfortable doing. I don't know if that's justice. I'm honestly not sure it's supposed to be. I'd genuinely like to know what you think, because I've gone back and forth on it more than I have on almost anything else that's happened to me. Was a quiet plaque enough for what Blanche Whitley lost? Her standing, her career, 15 years of silence she carried until she was dying before she ever told her own mother the truth? Or did Dr. Steele get to walk away from this far too easily? Simply because Estella Whitley was gracious enough and tired enough not to ask for more than she did. I'd love to hear where you land, because I still don't fully know where I land myself. And this is exactly the kind of question I made this channel to sit with, together, rather than answer for you. If this story stayed with you, do me a favor and hit that like button. It genuinely helps more people find these stories, and it lets me know which of these chapters of my life are actually landing with you. Leave a comment telling me honestly whether you think Dr. Steele did enough, or whether Estella deserved more than a name on a plaque after everything her daughter went through. If you know someone who'd sit with a story like this the way you just did, send it their way. Some of you have told me these episodes have started real conversations in your own families, and that means more to me than any of you probably realize. Turn on notifications for this channel so you don't miss whatever comes looking for me next. Because if the last several years of my life have taught me anything, it's that I never get to choose when the next envelope arrives. And if you're new here, subscribe, because this isn't a story that ends cleanly in one video. It's one ongoing life, mine, unfolding one chapter at a time. Last thing, and it's my favorite part of making these videos, tell me in the comments where in the world you're watching this from tonight. I read every single one, and I promise you, it's the part of this whole strange job that never stops meaning something to me.